spent my years working on drugs. And it's not, as you might be thinking, I was working on drugs. I worked for the past 3 years in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Mexico and the Organization of American States, developing drug policies in the Americas and monitoring them. So let me just start with the spoiler of what I'm going to talk about. After this spoiler, if you want to leave, please feel free to do it. I will be trying to convince you in the next 30 minutes about why the war on drugs has not been a helpful policy to solve the drug problem in the Americas. It has created more problems than those that it has solved. The second point that I will use in my presentation will be, some people argue that legalization is the solution. And even though it might be a solution to some of the problems, I agree, it does not solve every problem of the world drug problem, which is a very complex problem. And the third point and last, which I will address, is what the international community has now said should be the solution, which is solve the social and economic inequality, and it's all over the world. So let me start with the war on drugs. Some historians and pundits might argue that the war on drugs in the Americas started in 1982 with President Ronald Reagan. But the truth is that the war on drugs in this continent started in 1519 when the Spaniards arrived to Mexico, at least. When they arrived to Mexico, they found lots of civilizations that were using peyote and hallucinogenic mushrooms for dividing the future and for ceremonial purposes. The Spaniards, party poopers, they decided that it wasn't, they were not going to tolerate that. And they enacted the first anti-drug laws of the continent. And they were very tough trying to eradicate the peyote. Sorry if I didn't bring any free samples today. So it will be impossible to speak in 20 minutes about 500 years of war on drugs in America. So let me start 3.5 decades ago with President Ronald Reagan, when in October 2, 1982, he said in a very popular speech, we are going to win the war on drugs. His presidency was branded by the war on Even his wife, First Lady Nancy Reagan, was on board in this campaign. And she started a very popular slogan, you might know it, that just say no. It's interesting that, and I will tell you just an irrelevant fact, but the presidency of Ronald Reagan was from 1981 to 1989. And in this time, the most popular slogan was just say no. Do you know what was the slogan that entered with full force in 1988, one year before President Reagan got out of office? It was just do it. It's contradictory. Just do it. It doesn't have to do with policy. So let me go back to the war on drugs. President Reagan spent hundreds of millions of dollars in the fight against drugs, not only in the United States, but across the Americas. And the bottom line of his policy of the war on drugs was to get stricter prosecutions, to get more people with drug-related crimes incarcerated, and he did it. The bottom line of his policy was stricter punishment. And it was the right thing to do in that time when Colombian and Mexican cartels were getting stronger than ever. But 36 years after he started it, you judge by yourself the numbers and decide if it was a good idea or not. 1 year before he took office, 500,000 inmates were in the prisons of the United States. And right now, there are 2.2 million inmates in the United States. 2.2 million, it's a lot. Let me tell you how much is much. 2.2 million represent 25% of the world inmate population. Even though the United States have only 5% of the population, the total imprisoned people represent 25% of the population. That's how much. And one of the reasons why these numbers have increased is because, I will let President Obama tell you why it has increased. He said, over the last few decades, we have locked up more and more non-violent drug offenders than ever before, for longer than ever before, and that is the real reason our prison population is so high. He just said that in 2015, and in a country or in a world where it's always about the money, how much does it cost to keep in prison 2.2 million inmates? Well, per year, per inmate, the US government spends $30,000. That's half of your tuition here in Cornell Law School. That's a lot. Per day, it costs $83. And multiply that for 2.2 million, and you'll get, that's what the American government is spending in prisons, 80 billion. 80 billions, and from those 80 billions represent dollars that are not being invested in schools, in hospitals, in infrastructure. So it's a real problem. And the reason why I decided to start this presentation with the American case, with the case of the United States of America. Oh no, I have not finished it, yeah. From these 2.2 million people, 60% of the inmates are African American and Latinos, even though they represent only, together, 30% of the American population. What does it mean? About 1 in every 35 American right now, men, and 1 in every 88 Latino is serving time right now. Do you know what the number is with the white people? It's 1 in 214. That's a big difference. That's a big difference. And it's not only endemic from the United States, it happens all across the continent. But the reason why I decided to start this conversation with you, with the American case, is because the policies that have been adopted throughout the years in America have been exported throughout the continent. It's the doctrine, the Monroe Doctrine, America for the Americans. And the Iron Fist of the Americans and the war on drugs was exported throughout the continent. And it will be impossible to speak in the remaining 15 minutes or 20 minutes about the impact and the result that has happened and how has affected every country in the Americas. Because it depends, it varies. It varies depending on whether they are drug producer countries, drug consumer countries, or drug transit countries. So for time limit reasons, I will refer just to the case of Mexico. Not only because it is my country, but only because it is a country which is considered as a drug producer and as a drug transit country, even though the drug consumption is going high and high and high. So Mexico's vicinity with the United States, the largest consumer of drugs, has created a multi-million-dollar business for drug cartels. Just for you to imagine how big this market is, Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, you may know him as El Chapo, was ranked in 2012 as the 63rd most powerful person in the world. And during the past years, he has been ranked among the billionaires of the world by Forbes magazine. Experts in drugs say he's the leader of the Sinaloa cartel, who are responsible for the traffic of drugs, of 25% of the drugs that arrive to the United States. And they have an estimate that they receive $3 billion per year for the traffic of drugs into the United States. So that's how big the market is, and that's just 25%. But let me put the problem into perspective. Mexico is a very big country, very big, with a very large population. We have 122 million people. And if you want to know how big it is, Mexico is the size 4 times of Spain. I promise, I checked that. It's not just a picture. It's 4 times the size of Spain. And the real problem of violence, it would be naive, fallacious to deny that there is a violence problem in Mexico. But the problem is located in the northern states. In the northern states, those states in which are the most, you can find more routes to the United States to traffic drugs. But from Mexico City, which is in Italy, Mexico City is in Italy, right here, to the south and southeast, you won't find any bad hombres at all. You will find just a great time. You will have a great time. So please visit Mexico. This has been my honeymoon in Chichen Itza, one of the 7 wonders of the world. You will love it. I promise you won't have any problem at all. Just try to avoid the northern states, where there is, unfortunately, a big problem. So even though Mexico followed the policy of the United States in 1982 of the war on drugs, our country started its real war on drugs until 2006, when President Felipe Calderón was elected, and only 10 days after his appointment, after his inauguration day, he declared war on drugs, and he deployed 5,000 troops to the state of Michoacán, where organized crime had gotten out of control, and he sent as well troops to the major cities in the northern states, Ciudad Juárez, Tijuana, Laredo. So he militarized the streets. Was that a good idea? everyone at the moment thought it was a good idea. Something had to be done. But let's judge 10 years after that decision if it was a good idea or not. You tell me. Streets were militarized. 1 year before he took office in 2005, the murder rate in Mexico was 9.5 per 100,000 inhabitants. In 2012, it more than doubled. It became 21 murders per 100,000 inhabitants. That's a lot. That's a lot. What has happened now? The actual president, Enrique Peña Nieto, has softened this war on drugs, and there has been a decrease in the murder rate, but it's still a high number, and they're working on it. Finally, they're figuring out that the war on drugs is not the solution to the problem. But 10 years, what has happened in 10 years? 150,000 persons have been killed, and 20,000 have been reported as disappeared. So you judge by yourselves. You may think, yeah, we need an iron fist all over the world. And that's your opinion, it's okay. I won't argue that, but these are just the facts. And the problem in Mexico became like the scene between Hercules and the Hydra from Disney. Do you remember that scene? It is just, remember, Hercules fought against this dragon. And when he cut its head, he thought he had won, but 3 new heads grew. And after he got all those 3 heads, it was an impossible problem to solve for him. And the same thing happened with the Mexican government and the drug cartels. Every time the Mexican government put in prison a drug lord, three new gangsters would come up and take his place. So it became a never-ending story between the drug cartels and the Mexican government. That's what happened. Hercules versus the Hydra. So people all over the country, all over the Americas have said, hey, let's stop this war. Let's stop this useless and failed war. And if it's not war on drugs, then what is the solution for the world drug problem? Some people have said, some pundits actually have said that legalization is the solution. And even though I have to agree with that legalization solves many of the problems that the world drug problem creates, such as the government can guarantee the quality of the drugs that drug users are using, that the government can raise taxes from the sales of those drugs, that they are cutting the flow of income to the drug dealers. I agree. But they are not solving the organized crime problem and the violence problem that is behind legalization. And let me explain you why. Let's suppose that from one day to another, the Mexican government decided to legalize at least marijuana, or drugs in general. An estimate of 400,000 people in Mexico receive direct money from drug trafficking, whether they are farmers, drug lords, kingpins, lawyers, secretaries, you name it. A lot of people receive their money from the drug industry. So we cannot expect these people to say, I got out of business, it's time for me to go to school and become a lawyer or a doctor or an accountant. Of course not. These people who has lacked opportunities all their life. And instead of becoming being drug dealers, they will become probably kidnappers or robbers or blackmailers. You name it. It's a reform, so it wouldn't solve it. And let's suppose that, well, actually, in countries like Uruguay or states like Colorado, Washington, they have not ended the black market of marijuana. People who sell marijuana legally, they have to pay taxes, they have to pay electricity, water, they have to pay social security for their workers. So the cost of the product increases. On the other hand, the black market can sell their drug for cheaper prices. And the legalization does not reduce the drug abuse. The real problem is not the drug use. It's the drug abuse. It has a lot of economical repercussions for the country that has to invest in the health systems to improve this condition. And for instance, in the United States, some of you might be aware that there are 4 states, as we speak, there are 4 states and the District of Columbia that have legalized the recreational use of marijuana. Alaska, Colorado, Oregon, and Washington State. And additional to that, this past Tuesday, American voters did not only vote to elect a racist bigot who has called Mexicans rapists and criminals. No. The American voters also voted in 3 states, Massachusetts, Nevada, and California, to legalize the recreational use of marijuana. They have not enacted this law, but eventually it will be signed by their respective governors. And they will be able to find legalized marijuana. So even though it sounds nice, I have to admit that I agree that it's a nice solution for the states to legalize their own production of marijuana. It is contrary to the 3 United Nations drug conventions that the United States have signed and ratified. This referendums puts the United States in a position of clear violation of international law. If they had wanted to legalize marijuana and be still in compliance with international law, they should have done what Bolivia did in 2009. Bolivia in 2009 drafted and enacted a new constitution. A constitution, let me tell you about Bolivia first. Bolivia is a country where it is traditional, it's a tradition, it's part of their culture, to chew coca leaf and to use the coca leaves in teas. And it's used to heal headaches and heal many other problems. And it's traditional. It has been a millenary tradition since pre-Columbian times. So they decided to elevate these rights to a constitutional right. And actually, in Article 384, you can see that the chewing of coca leaf is a constitutional right in that country. So they knew they were in clear violation of the international law. So what they did is the following, and that's what the United States should have done. They requested a reform, an amendment of the international treaties to the Secretary General of the United Nations. It was denied, as it was expected. So they said, all right, we will say goodbye. They denounced the convention, which means that they got out of it. But as soon as they got out, they immediately requested to be readmitted into the convention, but with one reserve, the reserve of being allowed to chew coca leaf. And that's what they did. They were readmitted, and now they're part of the convention, and they're in compliance of the international law. That's what the United States should have done this happened in 2009, but that's what the United States should do if they want to be in compliance with international law. You know what country voted against the readmission of Bolivia? It was the United States. I don't know if their position in 2009, after what is going on here with legalization, would be the same. But it's just the fact that they voted against, and now they're in clear violation of the international drug law. So if the war on drugs is not the solution, a legalization just solves some of the many problems of a complex problem. What's the solution? Well, this past April, the ANGAS 2016 was held. And for many of you who don't know what the ANGAS is, the ANGAS was for diplomats what as Lollapalooza is for you many music fans. It was the event where everyone wanted to be. Every country sent their inputs to solve the drug problem through their very own perspectives. It was a very rich conversation between all the nations. And even though they had different approaches, they agreed on one particular topic. They agreed that the real problem behind the world drug problem was the economic inequality. Economic inequality creates poverty, violence, hunger, lack of opportunities, lack of employment, and particularly in a country like Mexico, which is very unequal, I have to admit. Some of the poor kids and poor youngsters see drug trafficking as their only solution to get out of their socioeconomic misery. And even though they know they might end imprisoned or death, they have said this proudly. They prefer to live 5 years as a king than to work 50 years as a donkey. That's their motto. And how can you fight that? You can only fight. You cannot fight that with more violence. You fight that, and that's what the international community agreed after the ANGAS resolution in April. That the solution is solved through education, through health, through employment, through inclusion, and not through more violence. So now that you know how bloody, how violent has been the war on drugs in my country, next time someone offers you marijuana, you know what to say. Only if it was grown in California. Thank you very much.